Israel is committing war crimes in Gaza. They include the collective punishment of innocent Palestinians and the forced transfer of 1.2 million civilians from the north of the territory to the south. And yet reaction from senior British politicians has been pretty uncritical, if not outright supportive. There are a few dissenting voices, though, and perhaps surprisingly, the loudest have come from Tory MPs. Conservative MP Crispin Blunt is former chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. He's also co-director of the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians. Speaking on the BBC, he issued this warning to the government.
The United Kingdom government has given unequivocal support to the State of Israel, a statement repeated by the Prime Minister yesterday. And I'm uncertain that they fully understand the implications of the developments of international law, whereby if you are encouraging a party to undertake a war crime, you become complicit in that crime itself. And it's absolutely clear now that what is happening in Gaza does amount to a war crime because it is disproportionate and does not distinguish the targets it is taking out, hence the terrible number of children that have been killed. And what we've just heard from the World Health Organization and the concerns about the effect of the transfer on the hospitals.
Well,
but
you will know that
a forced transfer of 1.2 million people is an absolute crime under the laws of war. You are simply not allowed to do it, as indeed is the collective punishment of the people of Gaza with a siege and the imposition of no food and no water and no electricity.
Backing up Blunt's assessment of the situation, the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians wrote to Rishi Sunak over the weekend. In their letter, they gave Sunak notice of their intention to prosecute the UK government over, quote, their role in providing military, economic and political support to Israel, which has aided Israel's perpetration of war crimes. In a separate interview on Sky, Blunt went further, accusing the government of complicity in Israeli war crimes.
The government has said that they support Israel's right to defend itself.
Of course, but it must be within international law.
Okay, so where is the complicity here on the part?
Because if you know that a party is going to commit a war crime, and this forcible transfer of people is a precise breach of one of the statutes that governs international law and all states in this area, then you are making yourself complicit. And as international law has developed in this area, the fact of being complicit makes you equally guilty to the party carrying out the crime. And this is now the last defence for Palestinians in this situation, is that international law will then begin to operate, make international leaders conscious of their duties under international law, and the fact that in the end, they can't ignore it. And they ought to be acting to restrain our ally from taking actions that are breaches of international law.
So that is what you're warning the Prime Minister, that you're saying that is what he and other government ministers
it goes beyond,
must do.
It goes beyond government ministers. Indeed, any politician who is then egging Israel on to breach international law and support Israel in the conduct of this operation. Of course, our hearts will go out to the State of Israel and people there for the appalling atrocity committed on it. But what we're not allowed to do is witness one crime being piled on with another, which is simply going to make the situation worse, but it's also fundamentally wrong.
Now, I don't think there are many ordinary members of the British public who watch that and think, oh my God, Crispin Blunt, what an apologist for terror, right? He's making a very principled stance, which I think is very common sense, which is to say, yes, Hamas's atrocities were atrocities. They were terrible. At the same time, you don't pile war crimes on war crimes. A war crime doesn't justify a war crime. He's brave enough to say it. Now, obviously, he's a backbench MP. He's not trying to win a majority at the next general election. But I really don't think that Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak would be punished by the electorate for saying what Crispin Blunt is saying right there. It is also interesting, actually, that we have seen these sort of legal letters to Sunak and Starmer. Potentially, they are making a difference because their tone has changed this week compared to last week. Also, lots of people actually now saying writing to your MP might be worth it right now. We don't often say, it's probably worth writing to your MP, but I think on this issue, because UK leaders have been so outrageous, I do think that there are lots of right-thinking people who are outraged, and I think it's good to remind your representatives of that. Crispin Blunt isn't the only Tory MP calling for Israel to back away from war crimes either. Now, the current chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia Kearns, told LBC this about Israel's siege of Gaza.
Do you think that Israel should turn back on the water and turn back on the electricity?
I believe they have to, because they have a duty under international humanitarian law to make sure that people can access medical aid and support. That cannot currently be done. And the Egyptians can't open the Rafah crossing again, as it's called, because it was bombarded, it was bombed by Israel. They need to reopen it. The Egyptians have already said that they will take all the humanitarian aid people want to get into Gaza. They will take it from their airport, but they need assurances from Israel that no humanitarian convoy will be bombed. This is something the UK can do. We can work with our Israeli partners. We've deployed ships to help them with the risk of transnational terror and support from other terrorist groups around the world. But we can also be a friend and say, let's get the Rafah crossing open, because that's also how we get British nationals out who are stuck in Gaza, particularly the doctors who will have been out there volunteering. We get the humanitarian aid in, but no one else can switch back on water apart from the Israelis. And they do have a duty to, I believe, under international humanitarian law, because they control the airspace of Gaza, they control the coastal access, and they have blockaded it. And so, in effect, I believe that they have that duty.
Again, a completely common sense position. And I suppose because these are backbench MPs, senior backbench MPs, they chair the relevant committee, but they're not constantly focus grouping their answers. I assume with Keir Starmer, that's what's going on. They're focus grouping their answers. I mean, I think with him, it's actually that he's terrified of the people who called Labour anti-Semitic beforehand. Now he wants to sort of say, no, definitely, we're 100% backing Israel. He also wants to distinguish himself from Jeremy Corbyn. But in any case, when the stakes are this high, I find that quite despicable. Let's go to Kearns again, because speaking on the Newsagents podcast, she made this wider point.
Israel has to defeat Hamas, not just in the interest of the people of Israel, but actually the wider region. But that is therefore difficult, because what you don't want to be seen to be is somehow not supportive of Israel, particularly given all that they have been through. But I believe as a politician, you also have a duty to give those difficult messages, to say that humanitarian law is not something you opt in and out of, and that we have a duty as Britain to be tough with our friends and put those messages across.
But that's the point, isn't it? Can it be right? It is clear, as you say, Hamas wants to wipe Israel off the map. But it cannot be right that in response to that, Israel wipes Gaza off the map.
Yeah, and this is the problem. This is a counter-terrorism operation. I think it's really important that that's how we should be talking about it. This isn't a war on Palestine. This has to be a counter-terrorism operation, which is difficult. Hamas is hiding out amongst civilians, but we've dealt with that in the past.
What do you make of the fact that these two Tory backbenchers are sort of speaking the most sense of, I think, anyone in the House of Commons at the moment?
Well, thank God for them, Michael. I think it's pretty extraordinary. And thank God they're not Labour MPs. Because, of course, if they were, then there would be calls for them to lose the whip and for Keir Starmer to remove them. And that they have no place in the public conversation. But because they're in the Conservative Party, where there is actually, when it comes to the internal party operation, a measure of democracy, there is not such a centralisation of power. They can just get rid of people willy-nilly. When they did, like under Boris Johnson in 2019, it caused a furore. It happened, but there was an uproar. When it happens in Labour, the media cheer it on. I think actually this really underscores the importance of not having over-centralisation at Westminster, not allowing the party leaders of our two main parties to effectively become demigods and determine who can say what, where, and when. And that's because sometimes both parties have a consensus on an issue, like with Iraq, like here right now with Gaza, in terms of supporting Israel and committing, frankly, war crimes. They're both wrong. And the problem with the two-party system is, Michael, that doesn't really leave much space for dissenting voices. Dissenting voices can be right. And so when you have two parties, you need to also have a culture and an acceptance of the fact that the two leaders won't always make the right calls. And this idea that you have just two parties and that the leaders are effectively presidential-style figures, it is really anti-democratic, not undemocratic, anti-democratic. So thank God for these two people. And I'll say this again, it would be inconceivable for a Labour MP to be involved in efforts to potentially charge leading politicians, including the Prime Minister, with aiding and abetting war crimes, which is precisely what is happening with a Conservative MP right now. So thank goodness for them. But I also think this really highlights the problems of what our media class has been calling for in Labour, which is give Keir Starmer all the power. That makes him electable. That's the only way Labour can do politics if they want to be grown up. and bugger the rest, bugger the backbenchers, no dissent. They have to toe the line or they're out. That's not good for Labour. It's not good for the country.
Let's move on to Labour, because those messages you just heard calling for de-escalation and respect for international law from senior backbench Tories are the kind of thing you would, in theory, hope to hear from Labour. But instead, both Keir Starmer and Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry have refused to condemn Israel's actions in Gaza, with Starmer even saying Israel has the right to withhold power and water from the Strip. And ahead of Palestinian solidarity protests that took place across the UK at the weekend, the party sent this letter to its local Labour Party groups. They said, there will be a number of protests and demonstrations taking place over the weekend. Elected representatives have been given strong advice not to attend any of these events, and I would urge you to exercise similar caution. Not only is this in the interest of our members' safety, but also to avoid placing colleagues in a position where they may share a platform with or are close to individuals that threaten to undermine the values and principles of the Labour Party. I'm not sure why it would be, for individuals' safety. Now, I was actually away this weekend, so I didn't go to the Palestine demo, but many of my friends did, many of my colleagues did. And I haven't heard from any of them that it was a particularly dangerous place. I mean, I did see one video on Twitter that looked somewhat unpleasant, but I mean, there are 150,000 people on this demo, so the idea it was dangerous to attend seems a little bit counterintuitive to me. On the BBC, Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy gave this justification for that advice to elected officials.
It's important that as we face and want to be the next government, that people do not share platforms with people who do not share Labour values, that they're careful and cautious. And we've seen Labour members of Parliament exercise that caution over the last few days, and I think that must be right.
So are you saying, because again, I want to be clear, if you're a Labour MP or Labour councillor, you shouldn't go, for example, to a pro-Palestinian rally?
If you're a Labour MP, you should always be careful whom you share platforms with at this moment. And you should be very careful that you do nothing to drive division in our communities.
Okay.
There's a rise in anti-Semitism. There's a rise in Islamophobia in our country as I speak.
And are you saying,
as an MP,
just so I'm
in
clear,
a position of responsibility, you do everything to minimize those who would sow division.
And are you saying they can't go to a pro-Israel rally?
Guidance has gone out. It's very clear what that guidance is. People have a right to protest in our country. It's a right we defend because we're a democracy, just as we defend the rule of law and international law. So people have the right to protest.
Okay.
But we as leaders in our community should be very judicious and careful, I think, at this time. That's the right thing to do. And it's particularly the right thing to do if you hope one day to be the government.
Listen to in isolation, right? I do agree with that statement, but it doesn't disagree. Sorry, I do disagree with that statement, listen to in isolation, but it doesn't, disgust me. What disgusts me is listening to that statement with the knowledge of what the Labour Party have been saying over the past week, right? So if you were really concerned with community cohesion and not being seen to take a side and sort of bringing people together, you would say, yes, what we saw in Israel is tragic. Those attacks on civilians were despicable. Also, what we are seeing in Gaza is disgusting, and attacks on civilians are despicable. Instead, what we've seen, and we've been talking about this over the past week, we've put out videos on this. You've had Keir Starmer asked, do you have any thoughts at all about Gaza? And he said, oh, no one wants to see this, but I 100% stand in solidarity with Israel who have a right to defend themselves. Labour have been taking sides. There is no way that anyone could possibly argue that they have been somewhat judicious in terms of siding with one side or another in what is a very long conflict, war, oppression, occupation. Now we're seeing, the collective punishment of a lot of people, and a lot of people for whom, their destiny matters a lot to members of the British public. Right now, you can talk about it in terms of religious or ethnic communities. Obviously, on that demo, you've got people from all different sorts of backgrounds. There are a lot of people in the country who care about the Palestinians, who care about the Gazans. And I think it was pretty goddamn divisive for Keir Starmer to tour the studios last week. David Lammy did it as well, and basically said, we don't give a damn about these Gazans, right? Turn off their water. Yeah, go for it. Israel has a right to defend itself. Turn off their electricity. Go for it. Israel has a right to defend themselves. Do you oppose bombing civilian flats? Well, war is messy, right? That is not a judicious response, which gives due respect to the fact that this is a highly charged issue in this country which has the potential to divide communities, right? And if you don't want to divide communities, the thing you don't do is side entirely with one and dismiss the other, which is what the Labour leadership have done over the past week or so. Now, as far as we're aware, not a single Labour MP turned up to any of those protests. I mean, we might be wrong, but it doesn't seem as if they did. Other elected Labour officials have shown a bit more backbone, though. Shaista Aziz and Amal Latif were Labour councillors for Oxford until this weekend when they resigned. They said this: "We are deeply disappointed and alarmed at the Labour Party, or the Labour Party leader, Keir Starmer's comments, seeming to condone the use of collective punishment against the people of Gaza in direct contravention of international law. We have sought to seek urgent clarification regarding these statements from both the national and local leadership. Unfortunately, as no clarification has been forthcoming, we have made a conscious decision to immediately resign the whip and leave the Labour Party." In Stroud, Labour councillor Jesse Hoskin has also quit over Starmer's comments, saying this: 2 million Palestinians in Gaza who had nothing to do with Hamas's actions should not be punished collectively for it. We are witnessing atrocities. I have not had the support of other Stroud District Labour councillors in unequivocally distancing myself from comments made by Keir Starmer and senior shadow ministers supporting war crimes against Palestinian people. In his BBC interview, Lammy was given an opportunity to condemn Israel for the forced transfer of Gazans to the south of the territory.
Do you support the order to move them or not?
The order to move them? Well, clearly.
Just yes or no?
It's not a yes or no, Victoria. I'm hoping one day to be Foreign Secretary and a Chief Diplomat, so it's not a yes or no.
Why not? Why not?
Can I answer the question?
Please.
Very simply. This is a war situation. War is ugly.
Yes.
Very, very sadly, people die. We have rules, and those rules mean that you must minimise death. Now, you know, and I know, because Netanyahu has said that there will be an invasion shortly. Against that backdrop, of course it's right that civilians must not be in harm's way, and an order has been issued.
Okay.
I'm glad that that order has been extended. Of course I am. But the point I want to get across is that it's hugely important that we minimise the loss of human life.
Right.
And anyone
let's
seeing
talk
those scenes
about
from
international
Gaza,
humanitarian
it's
law.
horrendous for those people that are facing that at this point in time.
The UN Human Rights Commissioner says the imposition of sieges that endanger the lives of civilians is prohibited under international humanitarian law. Keir Starmer, your leader, a human rights lawyer, says Israel does have the right to impose a siege. Who is right?
In situations of war, where there are allegations of war crimes, that must ultimately be a matter for the UN and its agencies and for the ICC. No. I'm sorry, Victoria, that is the case. This is not a moment for me to pass judgment about whether I'm not here as a lawyer.
War crimes, and neither was the UN Human Rights Commissioner. He was saying it's breaking international law to impose a siege.
He's entitled to his view.
It's not a view. It's not just plucked an opinion out of the air. He's looking at the framework, the Geneva Conventions. He says the imposition of sieges, which endangers the lives of civilians, is prohibited under international humanitarian law. Keir Starmer says Israel has a right to impose a siege.
Who
is right?
Keir Starmer has said right from the beginning that any war, it's important that democracies uphold the rules-based order and that must be within international law.
And I'm simply asking
from the beginning. His statement today says that people should have access. And I have said to you, Victoria, I'm not here as an international lawyer. That is a determination of the UN and its agencies and the ICC. It's not a determination for me.
Well, the UN did say that a siege breaks international law. It's collective punishment, right? So it was a very, very cowardly answer, I think. And the reason I say that is this. He says, oh, if war crimes are committed, that's something for an international tribunal. Now, an international tribunal, that's going to happen. Well, it probably will never happen because it always gets blocked by the United States, who are a Security Council member. And so it's never the case that Israel does go to the ICC. But even if it were, that would be a long way down the line. Now, you are a politician. You have influence right now. It's no good to say, oh, yeah, it could be a war crime, might be. Who knows? I've got nothing to say about this. We'll leave it to the lawyers in a few years' time. You are a very high-profile politician. You can intervene in the present. You can't say, oh, this is something, we'll work it all out down the line. No, this is happening right now. You have influence. Do something with that influence. It's just so pathetic. And, to see that sort of dismissive attitude towards something which the UN is saying, it's very Tony Blair, right? It was the Labour Party, let's not forget, who went to Iraq. One of the things I thought about Keir Starmer, actually, he was against the Iraq war. He was a human rights lawyer. I was like, yeah, he's not going to stand up to vested interests, but presumably he's not going to be so wantonly addicted to the idea of international intervention and so dismissive of international norms and just, a lackey to the US. Presumably he'd be, have a little bit more backbone. I can't imagine him have really been any worse in this situation, right? Can you imagine in that Keir Starmer leadership election to Labour members, if people had been told that, imagine you're in this situation where the Israelis have turned off the entire water supply to the Gaza Strip and are blockading any energy so their desalination plants don't work. Keir Starmer says, yep, fine with that. Like he is as bad as New Labour now when it comes to international politics, which is just, incredibly depressing as a situation. And the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians has written to Keir Starmer as well as to the Prime Minister, Emily Thornberry and David Lammy as well. They say this morning, ICJP issued Keir Starmer, Emily Thornberry and David Lammy with a notice of intention to prosecute UK politicians for their role in aiding and abetting Israel's perpetration of war crimes. ICJP demands that the Labour Party leadership and UK politicians more broadly must call for an immediate ceasefire, call for an end to Israel's illegal siege and evacuation order for North Gaza, condemn Israel's war crimes and crimes against humanity. They should then press the government into immediate action to do the same. Aaron, it's pretty depressing, this, isn't it? They do sound a lot like New Labour in the run-up to the Iraq War.
Entirely, Michael. Entirely. And it's something we've talked about a lot. You really cannot underprice the possibility of a Labour government under Keir Starmer taking this country into some kind of conflict after 2024. Domestically, I think it's inarguable that Labour is a better bet than the Tories. You don't have to be particularly transformational to think that. You might think they might administer decline slightly better. Fine. I think that's probably what would be the case. But on foreign policy, it's perfectly possible that a Labour government is far more hawkish and ties itself far more closely to what the American government wants, what the State Department wants, and the demands of the so-called Western Alliance. That is highly likely. And so it's important right now, I think, for the left, and including people inside the Labour Party, to get on top of that, to get ahead of it. Because otherwise, yes, you may see something like a repeat of Iraq. You could. Because remember, of course, we're living in a time now, the second half of the 2020s, where we're seeing the return of great power politics. We're seeing the rise of China, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh, detente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and now, of course, Israel and Iran too. So it's an incredibly volatile moment geopolitically. And what's become clear to me over the last week, really, is the inability of Labour, particularly its leadership, to deal with these things seriously. Everything Keir Starmer does or David Lammy does is for domestic consumption and to appease press barons and to appeal to the financial lobby in this country. So they want to get big money donors, big corporates, be seen as a safe pair of hands for the UK defence exports industry and for its military and for US foreign policy. To hell with what's right, to hell with what most people in this country actually want, and to hell with, actually even Britain's foreign policy interests, frankly. Because if you look at what's happened over the last week, the unflinching support that's come from the EU, the UK, and the United States for Israel in regards to what it's doing in Gaza, not in regards to the 1,200 people who were killed, but in regards to what's happening in Gaza, has completely undermined their diplomatic efforts regarding Ukraine and elsewhere over the course of the last 3 years. Because if you're a middle-class Ukrainian or Taiwanese, you look at this, what's going on in Gaza, and your conclusion is quite simple. The United States, the EU, and the UK believe in might is right. In other words, when push comes to shove, we haven't got a chance. And so I don't really understand it in terms of its own internal coherence. And I think it shows how politically myopic Labour are on these immensely important questions, particularly on foreign policy. I don't think they're myopic and stupid on public ownership of water. I disagree with them, but I don't think they're going to arrive at a political settlement which is more destructive than what the Tories are responsible for. On foreign policy, that is most certainly the case.